Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to, continue on this dialogue because I think it is an important one, particularly with the anniversary of the national parks coming up, and what do we want to do to improve our park system as a recognition of where we've been over the last 100 years. And so, but I just want to be clear because I think just because the name of it's the Land and Water Conservation Fund, I'm okay with changing the name to it, to put the word acquisition in there, but it's clearly in the statute, reading from the statute, that the purpose of this is for the acquisition of lands, waters, or interests in land and water as follows. So it's clearly in the act. That's what's authorized. That's the purpose of it. So the act isn't just to theoretically conserve, but I do think that the backlog issue is a real issue. Now, I have ideas that, I think that we should do the roadless area rule and take care of backlogs at the same time. Set aside what we're not going to do because it's in an unattractive part from the perspective of actual timber harvest, and then make investments in areas where we do have backlogs. So, but to blame the entire federal system backlog on the Land and Water Conservation Fund, I just think is not the right direction. We got to own up to what our obligations are to improve our federal lands and continue to see areas in which federal land acquisition might be done. So with that, Ms. Scarlett, you've been involved in these issues from two different perspectives, your role in the Department of Interior during the Bush administration, and now your position with the Nature Conservancy. In fact, I like to say that some of the best environmentalists on the Republican side of the aisle usually come from previous administrations who then decide that those were the right policies, and there's many Republicans who pushed, presidents who pushed great land policies, and I certainly want us to look at this as a bipartisan effort. But what can we do to make sure that we have land and water acquisition and also take care of maintenance?
Thank you, Senator. I want to offer several points on this. Looking at the backlog issue, I think we first have to look at its composition. So about half of it is roads, and I think appropriately we should be looking in the transportation reauthorization at addressing some of those challenges. Secondly, a not insignificant portion actually comes from disasters that have occurred and in which emergency supplemental funding has not covered the responses on federal public lands. And so including when those emergency supplemental occurs, funding to actually address those will also help. But I want to get to a much more important and central issue, which is I think the remedy to the maintenance backlog really needs to be tied to ways that reinforce sound agency management. And I think the Fish and Wildlife Service offers a recent example. They've actually decreased their maintenance backlog by about half in just a few short years. And they did that first by clearly characterizing those assets that needed repair and replacement. Secondly, by prioritizing and recognizing that everything on the list didn't really need to be addressed. A remote, unused, or seldom used, for example, road might have been on the list, doesn't really need repair. So they set clear priorities, management discipline, and then struck out to actually, within the appropriated annual budget, address them. I think the other agencies can similarly do the same. I want to make another point. I spent so many hours on this issue during my time at Interior. And one of the things we did was to actually look at industry standards. And the backlog itself is a little bit misleading because even in the private sector, there's always a backlog. What you want to do is to keep that backlog less than 10% of your capital asset replacement costs. Fish and Wildlife Service now has its backlog down to 4%, well within that industry best practice. Other ways to address it, recreation fees and keeping them on site, extraordinarily important. And then I'll conclude with another remedy. Increasingly, the Nature Conservancy, when we partner in Land and Water Conservation Fund efforts, brings some matching philanthropic funds to the table and actually create some endowments that can actually contribute to some management of those lands. So I think there's a lot of remedies here that are worth exploring. Thank you.
Well, I like, Mr. Connor, what about that? Looking at percentages and looking at various tools that would help for each of the individual backlogs. I mean, I think we should at least all come to an agreement as members of this committee, and believe me, we're a very diverse group of people here, but we ought to just come to an agreement. What is the maintenance backlog within the Department of Interior? let's put the number out there, and then we can decide what we want to do about it. But as I said, blaming it all on the Land and Water Conservation Fund as the source for taking care of all the backlogs on federal lands, I think we have to come up with other remedies.
Well, as a former deputy secretary, I listen to Lynn as much as possible, and it's been good advice that she's been given, and I think she's given some good advice today. I think she's absolutely right. We look at the maintenance backlog, we quantify it. It is 11.5%, $11.5 billion for the Park Service. It does approach $20 billion across the board, although that may include Bureau of Reclamation. There's always going to be some level of backlog, so we've got to separate and prioritize, and that's what we've done with respect to the Park Service, and that's what the Fish and Wildlife Service has done. So we've identified our highest priority non-transportation assets. We do think the transportation bill should be looked at, but there are these other programs, fees, as well as, particularly for the Park Service, the philanthropic organizations, the National Park Foundation, which is stepping up with respect to the centennial coming up, raising lots of private dollars because there is an interest in doing that. And we've got to marry up all these programs to deal with that overall deferred maintenance issue, which has gotten a little excessive. It is a priority. We just don't think that that needs to compete with the LWCF.
Thank you.